I'm delighted to welcome Andy Williams to Nottingham today. He's here mainly because of a shared acquaintance, Toby Murcutt, with whom I worked in the past. And Andy and Toby have actually written an article in 2013 on science journalism. And I think it might be related to this lecture.
Yeah, some of it is.
And once this lecture is finished, I think you should all go out and read the article itself. But yes, so Andy Williams is a lecturer at the Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, and he was previously an RCUK Research Fellow in Risk, Health and Science Communication. And he has a number of research interests which intersect with journalism studies and cultural studies, and also with all the topics we are discussing here at the conference. And his current major research interests relate to news sources and news sources, but anyway, news sources, and the influence of public relations on UK media. And I think the issue of public relations is really quite important and increasingly important, I think, and how it influences news reporting. And he has also worked on the media coverage of animal-human hybrid embryos, for example, and more recently he started to study the influence of online platforms and citizen journalism on traditional journalism. Today he will talk about various constraints under which journalists work, but I would also add under which the sources work as well, namely the scientists as well.
And the press office.
And the press officers and the PR people. We are all in the same boat, I think. So yes, welcome Andy Williams.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Andy and I'm a journalism studies academic at Cardiff University, where I research and teach, among other things, as Brigitte said, science, public relations and the news media. Given the very richly interdisciplinary nature of this meeting, I thought I'd give an insight into some of the areas that interest me about my field, not be so familiar with. It's journalism studies, media sociology, and I'll look at the areas which interest me through the lens of a couple of research projects which I've done in my short career as a researcher into science news. I've been looking at this stuff since about 2008. Firstly, I'll talk about some commonly accepted roles for science news. And then I'll go into some of the reasons why these aren't always realized. And these involve the recent changes in journalists' working conditions, how they work, the kind of constraints that they work under, the use of persuasive PR tactics by scientists campaigning around controversial scientific issues, and the rise of more day-to-day promotional activities in more routine communications of universities and publishers. Not the whole of science PR by any means, but a few different case studies to shed light on some problems. So I'll start by posing a gnarly and complicated and difficult question and giving a somewhat partial and simplistic answer. What should good science and health and environment news do? There are lots of answers to that, of course, but I just want to flag up two. Two of the broad roles that I think good science journalism should play. The normative injection there into the last panel. These are two of the roles I think science journalism, science news should play. Quote from William Lawrence, one of the pioneers of science journalism. A complex figure himself, actually, but not much time to go into that here today. And what did he say? The true descendants of Prometheus. Science writers take the fire from the scientific Olympus, the laboratories, the universities, and they bring it down to the people. Why am I telling you about what William Lawrence thought? Well, the main reason I wanted to flag this up is because it relates to that first major role for science news. The idea it should translate, that it should explain, it should pass on the findings of scientists to publics. It should give publics accurate, independent, understandable information about science, something that William Lawrence didn't always live up to himself, actually, but that's another story. The second major social role for science news is quite different, but it's also very important. Many tend to think of science journalism as a kind of public relations service, said a Nature editorial a few years ago, existing purely to explain new scientific findings to the masses. Now, this kind of laudatory reporting, says Nature, is not enough. Society needs to see science scrutinized as well as regurgitated if it is to give science its trust. And journalists are an essential part of that process. It came from an editorial called Science Journalism Cheerleader or Watchdog. And that's the second role I'd like us to just have in the back of our mind, really, as I go through some of the research which I've been doing. This journalism's independent, critical social function, monitorial social function, which it sometimes carries out with aplomb, as Brian Deere did, of course, when he unearthed the malpractice and the breaches of ethics and the conflicts of interest behind Andrew Wakefield's science in relation to the MMR vaccine and autism. But it doesn't do it as a profession very often. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about why. High quality, independent, and when needed, critical reporting about science or anything else is expensive. It costs in time, it costs in money, it costs in human resources, all of which are increasingly in short supply in mainstream news media outlets in the USA, much of Europe, elsewhere in the world as well. The whole industry in these places is facing a crisis in its business model, and this has meant substantial losses of journalists relative to the amount of news that's being produced. And these broad trends have serious implications for science news as well, obviously. Nowhere have these economic factors affected journalism about science quite as much as in the USA, where mainstream science coverage has tanked in recent years. Lots of indicators of that. In my own research, which is more about the UK, I've shown that since 2005, a number of national news outlets, very important ones, have been cutting their science staffs, and that many specialist science reporters that I talk to in my research have very clear worries that what's happening in the US is being replicated in the UK too. So I did some research into this crisis in journalism and what it meant for science journalists who are specialist reporters and their ability to do their jobs, really. I did an online survey of current science, health and environment specialist reporters. 42 responded, and that was about a 43% response rate, which isn't bad in this kind of journalism practice research. And I also did 52 long, semi-structured interviews with current and former science specialist journalists, looking at things like workloads, looking at things like role changes since the impact of new media, changes to their working practices, changes to their working routines. And I found a number of quite troubling things. Principal among them is that most journalists are simply pressured to do far more work than their historic counterparts, producing more stories on different platforms. 80% of the specialists that I surveyed said that their workloads had increased between 2005 and 2010, most of them increasing by quite a margin. Story counts, the amount of stories that they have to write, have gone up since the 1990s quite substantially. And there's now, of course, a lot more pressure on them to produce news across platforms, on the internet and in places where they weren't previously producing it. Basic day-to-day tasks like finding original news stories, like researching science stories, like fact-checking stories, are now under increasing pressure. Almost half of the UK specialists claim that they now have less time to check their stories and their facts for accuracy than they used to. While almost a quarter say that they don't have enough time to make what they see as adequate checks on their facts. Basically, we've got the same number or fewer journalists expected to do a lot more work in the same amount of time. This is what some of them said about workloads. I think in terms of output, it's probably a lot more than it used to be. I'm churning more stuff out, basically. And the one at the bottom, with fewer staff, everybody just has to write more stories. It's all become extremely on this professional level. It's almost like we're working in banks. It was the worst thing she could imagine. This one in the middle, these two are from fairly long-serving journalists, been there in newsrooms for about 10 years. This one was a younger journalist. We do get through quite a lot of copy a day, and some people call it churnalism. And people look at that as a negative thing. But sometimes I think you've got to cover all the bases. And you make a choice whether or not you really want to investigate one story fully, or you want to cover 5 stories to an adequate standard so they can be accepted and go online. He didn't know any different, this journalist. There's a generational split in the interviews that I do. The older journalists realize that things have changed. The younger ones, not quite so much. Journalism. You may or may not have come into contact with that term. It's a word used to describe passive journalism, in which reporters don't or can't do much actual investigation, much checking, much research or critical scrutiny of what their sources say. Instead, they engage in cut and paste journalism, simply using prepackaged information subsidies in the form of press releases, news agency material, or the plagiarized copy of their competitors. That's what journalism is, in a nutshell. Lots of them explain to me that the process of verifying information in a news story can be very time-consuming when it's done properly. And the sheer number of stories that they have to write these days puts pressure on the amount of time that they've got available to do this kind of work. These quotes come from journalists talking about research and fact-checking. It used to be the case that if I was doing a Nature paper, writing up a story from a Nature press release, I'd spend a good afternoon on it. I'd make calls the night before to people in the States and that kind of thing. Whereas now, I can be asked to do it on the day, and I turn it around in an hour. It's not something I'm particularly proud of, but they're pretty reliable, the press releases you get from places like Nature. Another one, we hardly ever have enough time to research something properly. I'm often lucky if I get to read the paper and talk to the author. It's exceedingly important to do this, but there are just so many things to stay on top of that it's impossible to do. We have to take more on trust than I'd like to. Keep that in mind. More on that in a minute in relation to another study. This kind of stuff is worrying because of the accuracy issue, I guess. One thing hardly any of them seem to be aware of in their discourse with me, however, was that they're not just accepting facts on trust here. They're also accepting the narratives, the stories, the framing of an issue given to them by the source. And in regurgitating PR like this, they aren't just outsourcing news gathering, the act of deciding what is newsworthy. They're also, in large part and quite often, outsourcing decisions about how a story should be written, how a story should be presented. And this means an erosion of independence, I think. It's obviously attractive because it's easy. One reporter called this kind of PR-led journalism low-hanging fruit, easy stuff to turn around. And when you're up against it, the low-hanging fruit is attractive. There are signs that these workload pressures and the outsourcing that I mentioned have led to a de-skilling of the job. Lots of journalists told me that actually finding original stories wasn't really much part of their work anymore. So I put this statement to them. Most of my stories originate with me contacting potential sources. And only 23% of the respondents reported that this was the case for them. And 46% said that more often than not, they were the passive recipients of news story ideas from their sources. This can't be good, I think, for the prospect of science news as a watchdog, holding their sources to account. How likely are you to bite the hand which so routinely and efficiently feeds you, the lifeblood of your professional of your work? This quote from the retired health editor of the Times illustrates the de-skilling problem quite well. Retired journalists go on the record with social scientists. That's where I live. I don't know how many stories are independent these days, he says. Latterly, I was doing health, and I would get some independent stories, but I wouldn't say I went out looking for them desperately hard. The thing is, you can get through the day on the diary stories, which are generally PR-led, and nobody would say that you hadn't done a day's work. I suppose I lost the knack of finding them. We were told by others that news editors, the newsroom middle managers who decide how to fill up the newspapers and websites, are so unused to dealing with exclusive science stories that they're unsure how to act when they're faced with one. Sometimes, if you come up with a good science story, the question is, so what time's the embargo? And you're like, no, wait a minute, this is just ours. And that seems to flummox them. I was even told of a number of examples where journalists had a great exclusive critical story which they'd been working on in their own time, because that's when they work on this Fourth Estate stuff. And they knew that the only way they'd get it in the paper was to give it to a competitor at the Press Association or at another newspaper or news outlet, because then the news editor would see it elsewhere and tell them to nick it. Twice. I'm not over-egging that. Two different occasions that I was told of that. The exclusive science story is losing its currency at lots of national news outlets. Journalism is becoming the norm. Lots of them are reluctant to admit, like Nigel Hawkes did there, that they do this, or they do this kind of cut and paste journalism, but we know from other studies that they do. We did a study in Cardiff with Nick Davis for his book Flat Earth News, which showed very high levels of reliance on press releases in national news media stories. 60% of newspaper stories are composed wholly or mainly from these kinds of information subsidies. I want to shift attention away from news and journalists now. A bit of a step change for the rest of the talk. And I want to look at research that I've been doing into public relations. I think that research into news media shouldn't just stop at the news industry. It should also pay attention to where that news comes from. And in science news, of course, in large part, as people like us, it's researchers in universities or elsewhere. So as much as looking at the content of the news and journalistic working practices and the conditions under which news is produced, I also try to understand the sources of news, the resources that journalists draw on when researching what they do, and the people who they quote in the stories that they tell. Why? Well, if a lot of science news is influenced by PR in this way, then we've got to study the PR about science as well. And what did I look at exactly? Or what do I look at generally? It involves critical attention, I guess, to PR content, to promotional tactics and materials circulated by media managers, to the working routines of science press officers and other science communicators, and to the conditions which govern their work as well. I think that science PR is generally, in my field, a kind of under-researched field that's ripe for study. It's ripe because it's so large, so varied, it's been growing hugely in recent years, and because it's quite influential. Journalism's contraction in the last 2 decades has been more than matched by an expansion in the field of PR. And not only have those in industry been expanding their media and public communications, so energy, chemicals, agriculture, pesticides, food and drink, biotechnology, they've all been expanding and making more sophisticated their PR efforts. But so have public and civil society players like universities, like research councils, like academic science publishers, charities, NGOs, activists. So I'm going to touch on 2 of my own studies for the rest of the talk, which cast light on just a couple of the different ways that university scientists try to manage the news media along with their press officer colleagues. And the first deals with hybrid embryos, the preemptive PR campaign designed to persuade publics and policymakers and media about a very controversial issue in human genomics. And the second case study will be about more routine, more run-of-the-mill science PR. I want to look at what can happen when university scientists and other powerful scientific institutions engage in large-scale, persuasive media management campaigns. Now, this kind of thing doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and it's important when it happens. I'll talk about this case study, the PR campaign to overturn a proposed ban on animal-human hybrid embryos as part of the 2008 Human Fertilization and Embryology Act. They were successful. Give the end away at the start, as you know. The research explores quite bitter, at times, PR struggle between different powerful groups. There was a coalition of scientific organizations on the one hand, and there was a rather less cohesive group of religious figures, ethicists, campaigners, and politicians on the other. The scientists and science communicators wanted to create embryos which involved fusing animal and human genetic material in order to harvest stem cells so that they could understand incurable conditions and diseases like motor neuron disease, like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's. And the opponents wanted to stop them, largely because they thought it was gross. That was one of the big discursive presences in the media coverage, actually, the yuck factor. My research questions were focused on identifying PR tactics. They were focused on assessing the success of these PR tactics, and then trying to tease out any problems that might be associated with preemptive, persuasive PR campaigns around controversial science like this. Now, how did I answer them? I did a comprehensive newspaper content analysis of hybrid embryos in the UK national press, 420-odd items. And then I did a series of semi-structured interviews with key participants on both sides of this debate. So direct news sources like scientists, archbishops, campaigners, behind-the-scenes press officers from a range of key science and health journalists in the national news media. There were 16 of them in all, and I've published this research, so if you look it up, you can get a full list if you're interested. The media relations work on hybrid embryos breaks down into a number of key tactics, all of which are firmly rooted in PR practices developed in pretty much US corporate and political communications in the 80s. Fields like relationship management, issues management, crisis management. Let's look at some of these tactics. Firstly, the tactic of pooling one's communicational resources. Massive PR coalition, virtually the whole of the UK scientific establishment pooled resources and worked together. I think this may have been unprecedented, I'm not sure. And it meant a lot of communicational firepower. It was coordinated by the Science Media Centre and a core, what one participant described as a core war council of scientists and other press officers that met fortnightly over a 2.5-year period. Another campaign, another tactic, managing relationships between science and health journalists and the science. They did this very well, and it was key to their success. Very early on, they set up face-to-face briefings at the Science Media Centre, which would continue throughout. And this early relationship management was important in securing the impressive media relations win that they got. It meant that the science specialists were able to retain ownership of this story, even when it became very political. And that, as it turned out, meant that the scientists were quoted far more and that their opponents were quoted far less. They ended up dominating the press coverage in terms of both the people cited and the arguments that, of course, managed the issue. They managed the messages very, very well. They ensured a steady stream of written press briefings, visualizations, text-based information subsidies were supplied throughout from lots and lots of the different constituent organizations of the PR coalition. In effect, they dominated the information environment around this issue incredibly effectively from the position of the journalists who were dealing with them. But my interviews with the scientists and the press officers repeatedly and almost uniformly stressed that what they were doing wasn't campaigning. It also wasn't PR for a lot of them. Because it was all about neutral information transfer. It wasn't about persuasion, as well as a fair bit of what seems to me denial about the nature of the communicative practices being employed. I came across lots of verbal and rhetorical contortions which displayed a real anxiety about whether the participants were engaged in what might be called spinning science. One participant told me, "We imitated PR campaigners, but we weren't campaigning." Another one said, "It was a campaign, but it was a campaign in inverted commas." Another one stressed, "We never agreed key campaign messages, so that means that it wasn't a campaign." The messages were there. The content analysis shows this. There were 5 or 6 top cited messages. It doesn't matter if they agreed them or not, they were there. Another effective tactic, rapid reaction, managing minor crises like the rather bigoted interventions from the Catholic Church in Scotland, and stage-managed kind of campaigning PR, photo calls, which involve people affected by the conditions that were hoped insights could be given by the science. Not so core. I've only been able to give you a flavour of some of the key tactics. There's much more that I could have talked about, but time is limited. So I want to move on to some of the problems that I think are raised by the study. There's the problem of exploiting journalism. Oh yeah, that's the Sun's early treatment of hybrid embryos. Mutant. And that's Simon Cowell, by the way. Exploiting journalism. In this case, I think a weakened news media was too complicit with and reliant on its PR sources. It was consequently less likely to be independent or critical, or quote a more plural range of sources, at least in part because of this very effective media management work. Fiona Fox, the director of the Science Media Centre, told me that the SMC is a reaction to journalism, but we work so well because of journalism. They're self-consciously taking advantage of a weakness in science journalism here, at the same time as seeking to support science journalists. Secondly, the transparency and accountability issues. The fact that backstage media management is invisible in the public debates that are prompted by its actions. The public don't get to see it. It's very hard for researchers to try and understand its influence and pin that down. But it's invisible to publics. By necessity, most PR, unlike marketing, unlike advertising, the other kind of arm of the marketing industry, is not transparent. It seeks to secretly influence the news. And it does so in the interests of organizations. Not always, but conceivably sometimes against the public interest. Fiona Fox was again very open with me about this. About science journalists, she said, "We have different interests. Mostly, journalists don't notice that. They think we're with them, that we only exist to serve them. But we work on behalf of the scientific community, and we're going to use our savvy and our media skills to get them the best coverage and the best impact." And they did, but at a cost, I think. Another problem, the C word. Now, I use the word campaign throughout this study because it's a campaign. It's an organized, professional, and systematic attempt to persuade over a set period of time. Most of my interviewees disagreed with me. Some took the view that campaigning is basically what the other side did. It's based on prejudice. It's based on half-truths. I was told all the time that scientists' communicational practice was different because it was about providing neutral information anchored by scientific truth. Now this implies a lot. It implies a scientific privileging of the authority of scientists over the concerns of these lay campaigning publics, many of whom I don't have much sympathy with. But this wasn't a body of scientific knowledge which could be drawn on and communicated. This was prospective. This hadn't been done. You know? This was an illusion. It implies the existence of a unified body of scientific knowledge, which just wasn't there. And this is worrying not just to me. One of my interviewees was the then chief executive of the MRC, Leszek Borysewicz. He stressed the needs for scientists to remain open-minded when communicating. He said, once you cross that line, you get into the very dangerous territory of promoting propaganda for a particular course or direction. It's not for science to dominate society's views. Then there's the problem of simplification. There were a number of criticisms over the period of the coverage in the PR campaign that the science was oversimplified. Perennial problem, I know, but therefore miscommunicated. An example was the idea that these were 99.99% human, these embryos. It was there in a quarter of all news coverage. Very successful key message, but it's meaningless. People like Martin Evans were very critical of this, for instance, and quite annoyed, I think, that they didn't get much media coverage, nor did many other critical scientists. And this problem, I think, relates to the range of experts that were put up by the PR coalition, and especially by the SMC in their briefings. It was limited to those who supported this science. The problem of hype, another perennial problem. There were numerous claims in the interviews that the usefulness of this science were being overplayed. The promise of cures had been hyped to the media. And finally, the issue of scientific self-censorship. The idea here is that scientists see all the effort that goes into promoting something to the news media by their colleagues. Remember, this was a massive 2.5-year, 3-year campaign, and they hold back from engaging in honest and open public debate in order to present a unified front. And it seems here that there's a correlation between the PR effort expended to communicate the science and the likelihood of scientists self-censoring in public debate. Okay, another step change. Moving on to the final leg of what I wanted to talk about today. Starting to consider I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? It doesn't matter. It's just an amusing cartoon about the science news cycle, the first few steps of which are about press releases influencing news coverage. Paying critical attention then in this research to the work that we do with our press office colleagues in kind of routine promotional work about our research, writing press releases. Our study has found this or that. We've seen big increases in investment in communicating science to the news media across the university sector. Anecdotally, I'm sure many of us in the room have seen indications of this increased orientation in universities towards encouraging and fostering media coverage of research. Now, in my research so far, I've always tried to be attentive to the underlying causal factors behind what I find. So when I look at science news, I've tried not to individualize or personalize the critique. Blaming individual journalists for journalism is missing the point. The reporters cut and paste PR in the way that they do, largely because they're subject to institutional economic constraints which are beyond their control. Many of them linked to the troubled political economy of the news media, sometimes linked to the ideologies of the news organizations in which they work. So when I look at PR, I also want to try and pay attention to the conditions under which we work as academics and as press officers, and how these may be influencing and possibly changing the ways that we communicate science. Journalists notice this as well. That's from the first study that I was talking about. Former Guardian science editor Tim Radford gave me a historical perspective on changes in university science communication when he said that the conscious and manipulative media management that was always a feature of city reporting and of political reporting has spread very quickly to science in the last 2 decades. Another long-serving science journalist said, we went from famine to feast in the period between 1990 and now. You've gone from a period where you were scratching around for stories and you were glad if you found one, to one where you've got a choice between 4 or 5. All the journals put their stuff on the web. All the charities and the universities put their stuff on the web. There's been a major change, really. A growing body of research suggests that blaming journalism for the kind of inaccurate day-to-day science news that gets talked about quite a lot, although it's very common, it only tells us part of the story about what's going wrong when science news is inaccurate or sensationalist or hyped. And I want to try and understand this further. And to do that, I think we have to turn a critical eye on our own communications and what we do to communicate our research. And in some recent work that I've been involved in, led by some colleagues in psychology at Cardiff University, Chris Chambers and Petrox Sumner, and the Inside Out research group, we've been looking at the communication of health and biomedical science in press releases by Russell Group universities in the UK. The research is pretty much finalized, but it's unpublished. The rest of what I've been talking about today is published. So these findings should be treated as preliminary and not peer-reviewed. What do we do in this project? We started with a content analysis of published peer-reviewed journal articles about health, biomedical science from Russell Group universities in 2012, I think it was. And then we analysed the content of their corresponding press releases, 462 of them, and then the associated content of all the news coverage which followed. Newspapers and news agency stories, 668 of these. This kind of research is important, I think, because it focuses on the meat and drink of a lot of science news in the UK. The controversial stories like hybrids or GM or nuclear or climate change for that matter are obviously essential to understand, of course, but I think it's worth looking at the more routine, a study has found X, Y, or Z stories that make up actually the bulk of what people read in most of our news outlets about science. We wanted to look at the PR journalism relationship in the round and figure out where miscommunication, hype, exaggeration crept in along this chain of science communication you see at the top. We focused down on 3 common indicators of hype, of sensationalism, in press releases and news coverage. First of all, the presence of medical advice given to readers to change their behavior when none was actually in the published paper. Secondly, exaggerated causal statements based on correlational research. And thirdly, drawing inferences for human behavior based on animal research. And we found that between 1/3 to 45% of press releases and news stories, depending on the variable, exaggerate when compared to the published scientific papers. Okay, so there's quite a lot of exaggeration in the news and PR text. But what else did we find? How about this important question of whose fault it is? Okay, in the 40% of cases where news articles went beyond what was written by the scientists, what did its associated PR say? Was it down to the journalist or was it down to the press officer? Well, where news stories contained inflated statements relative to the journal articles, the corresponding PR was at least as inflated most of the time. Okay? The PR was exaggerated in 48% of cases for the medical evidence, for the medical advice variable, in 70% of cases for the causal correlational variable, and in 75% of cases where human inference was drawn from a study on animals. We also found actually very little evidence that PR exaggeration increases news uptake. Now, we assume that's why press officers and scientists let this happen. Yeah? They think that it's going to lead to more news coverage. But no, the PR which exaggerated didn't prompt more news stories than the PR which told it straight. So we might be routinely puffing our research utterly pointlessly, which is worrying. Intriguingly, we also found that the inclusion of caveats didn't seem to reduce uptake in the news media. In fact, press releases with caveats were associated with a slightly higher uptake in news stories. It's interesting, but why is this happening? That's where I want to go next with my research. I want to understand it, really. If blame can be meaningfully apportioned for this kind of thing, it probably, I think, lies with the increasing culture of university competition and self-promotion interacting with increased pressures on journalists to do more with less time. Clive Seal has written about the problem of the impact agenda and the way that the ref links media coverage with research funding by making citations in the news an indicator of influence on public policy debates. He talks about how this might lead to pressure on press officers to, I quote, engage in similar behavior to that of lobbying organizations. Many are doing that already, I think, in different contexts. And this is just part of the context in which I think this study has to be understood. There are potentially lots of ways that the transformation of universities into businesses in a competitive marketplace may influence the quality, the veracity, the independence of science communication. And I think that much more work is needed to tease out the structural reasons behind findings like these. And it should happen alongside the work on science journalism, or the kind of work on science journalism that I started telling you about. Just to sum up, in aggregate, I think that these findings suggest that the prospects for high-quality, independent science news in the mainstream news media are diminished. I started off by talking about two of the most important roles for science news: translating, giving independent and accurate information, and holding science to account when needed. It seems that in some important respects, a lot of the job of translating or conveying the news from scientists to various publics is being outsourced to, well, scientists. Not the greatest idea, really, I don't think, if independent news is what you want. The conditions which govern the way that scientists and press officers work, that journalists work, mean that they have little choice but to more and more act like stenographers to science. Likewise, the conditions under which many scientists and press officers work seem to mean that we can't always trust what they say or what we say either. Both projects that I've told you about find problems around transparency, accountability, plurality, simplification, exaggeration, hype. These are very real. And all of this also suggests potentially serious consequences for the ability of science news to play the occasional but necessary role of holding science to account. When changes in routine journalistic and scientific communicational practices facilitate such a shift in power from journalists to their news sources, it's far less likely that reporters are going to be able to play this critical democratic watchdog role when it is needed. Martin Bauer and Jane Gregory have written that both science and journalism are traditionally skeptical professions which interrogate and assess results critically. Their work seeks controversy, it seeks the debunking of myths. But PR, they say, serves to promote a positive image of its paymaster so as to minimize controversy and critical response. Lots of science PR, they say, is part of a move away from dialogic, democratic, public-centered approaches towards a one-way, business-influenced, public understanding of science, PUS Incorporated, PUS Inc. I broadly agree with that. I worry that the imbalance in power between science PR and science news might have the unintended consequences of weakening the independence and the skeptical edge and the interrogative ability and ultimately the credibility of both science and journalism.
Many thanks for this thought-provoking lecture. We have already got a question there. We have actually a little bit more time for questions as we had quite a long coffee break, so we can eat into that a little bit. So, let's see. For the next 10 minutes or so. Okay.
I agree with a lot of what you said, but you don't think you took it far enough. I mean, the slide about Nature press releases being reliable source of information was grotesque. They're most unreliable in my experience. They're PR for the journal, as opposed to PR for the authors. Well, they get mixed up. Well, I think in the next session we'll talk a bit what I think one might do about it. But so perhaps I'll stop.
The Nature quote came from a science journalist. We're doing the same study with journal PR at the moment as we did with Russell Group University PR. So soon you'll be able to point to some evidence to back that up.
People say safety. Yeah. Oh, sorry. And first, Beth first, then Phil, then you. Okay.
Is that all right? Thank you. I just wanted to say I thought that was a great talk, and I feel a bit guilty because in the Institute of Physics we were part of this media machine, if you like, feeding stories from journals to science journalists. So, but I share your concerns about it. Not so much about why we're doing it, because otherwise I wouldn't have been doing it, but about what then gets covered. So there's a kind of vicious circle to me where a certain type of story gets picked up, and therefore we start just issuing those type of stories, so it's a very negative feedback. And to me they fell into two categories, one of which, that's fine, was anything with a medical application, because people identify with it. I mean, that's my assumption. That's therefore why journalists pick it up and like to publish it. The other category is the one that makes me feel faintly uncomfortable, and I haven't got a better definition of it than that. But you know, a quirky story, and I think the biggest ever number of downloads we ever got as a result of a story from IOP journals was something about a football kick, Roberto Carlos in 1998. Some French physicist 20 years later, for no reason I could understand, had studied the physics of this, and it got enormous coverage. And to me, I have a big worry that that in the end actually gets science a bad name and undermines what you're trying to achieve. Sorry that wasn't so much a question, but a kind of sympathy.
So Bill, I think.
Thanks for a really fascinating talk. Just actually, I'll pick up on Beth's point in a second, but the first thing I wanted to point out is I'm going to add to David's voice of gloom and doom, in that your starting position is the published paper. In fact, the whole PR side of things is also distorting the scientific process, because what gets a paper into those top journals is not the rigor of the science, it's the newsworthiness and the fact that it'll act as clickbait or headlines. On Beth's point, so we're involved with something called 60 Symbols, as you know, which is a series of YouTube videos about various aspects of physics. What picks up the views there is exactly the type of quirky thing. I don't have a problem with that. I think if that's a win in terms of public understanding of science, that's a good way to do it. Quirkiness will bring people in, and then you can hopefully sell them some science on the back of that.
Can I come back really quickly, I promise?
No, please.
What really knocked me back on that was getting in a taxi one day, when something like that had been on the radio in the morning, and having the taxi driver say to me, "Don't try and wasting our money on this stuff." And then you see where the feedback.
Oh, it's very interesting. So we get those comments. So usually the best thing to do is avoid looking under the line for YouTube videos. 60 Symbols of government, sometimes it's a bit, I don't know if others have really had this challenge. What's very interesting is when that comment comes up, sometimes there will be 100 other comments attacking that particular comment, saying, well, no, this leads into so many others. So I'm not entirely convinced that the argument that this is just scientific ways of having seen it across the planet. I think it's a way of doing
Just as a response to Phil's point about the paper, that's something that we're completely aware of, and that, you know, it's something we've reflected on in our methodology. Obviously, it's a limitation of the study, and it means that the findings are probably conservative.
Okay. I think you were next, and then two gentlemen over there, and then this gentleman over there. Okay.
Hello, Dara here from the University of Bristol again. Just picking up on David's point and the last speaker as well. And great if you're addressing this, but I think you do need to go a couple of steps backwards, because I think science journalists work with what they've got, press officers work with what they've got, and the starting point is the paper, and that is only as good as the paper is. And you've mentioned the Wakefield example, the MMR one. That's a really good case in point, you know, because that was published in the Lancet, you know, high impact, very respected journal. And a lot of the criticism that the media came under for covering the story in the first instance didn't really tackle the fact that it had been published in the Lancet in the first place. Going back one step further, I think you also have to look at the pressure that academics are under to publish. I think everybody's very keenly aware of that. So, you know, maybe we need fewer, better papers that are more rigorously peer-reviewed. I think the other issue related to this is something that the BBC in particular is very partial to, is false balance, where you have different sides to an argument where they're given equal weight when in fact, you know, one is a minority view. We live in a democracy, everyone is entitled to an opinion, but the Wakefield MMR example is another good one, where that was seen as a valid opinion, whereas in fact his was a minority view. We've seen it with other things as well, like climate change. So I think, you know, organisations like the BBC need to take a lead on this, where if they're giving a view, that's absolutely fine, but make it clear that it's not a balanced argument, that the view is coming from a minority perspective.
I agree completely on the third point. On points 1 and 2, I disagree. Press officers only have the paper to deal with. Yeah? What our study finds is that when the caveats are in the paper, a significant amount of the press releases strip those caveats out. Yeah? Or they change it completely to make it seem like this was a study on humans when it was actually a study on animals. Or they give advice which wasn't in the paper. Yeah? So I'm not saying this is just on press officers, it's on press officers and the scientists who are signing off on those press releases, but this is a problem, okay? If we're either making very basic errors or puffing our science in press releases routinely, either way it's a big problem. Yeah? Secondly, the BMJ and it wasn't the BMJ, it was the Lancet and Wakefield's paper. There was no claim made about MMR being linked to the vaccine, or even measles in the paper, in the published paper in the Lancet. In fact, there's a line in there which says, we found no association between measles and autism, or something like that. That's a paraphrase, but that's what it said. The claim which went on to cause all of the media coverage was in the PR, okay? It was in the video news release that Wakefield put out at the Royal Free about his Lancet paper. It was, well, and we're also worried about this, yeah? So it's not always, oh, we can't blame the press officers, we can't blame the scientists. You know, there are problems here, and we need to pay attention to them.
I'm not sorry. I would like to ask a question, but I think I better do. Okay, so there's one more over there, and then there, and then there, and then there, and then I think we have to, see how it goes.
Yes, Daniele Fanelli from University of Montreal. I wanted to follow up on the comments about, well, maybe we should ignore, or maybe we shouldn't ignore the number of clicks in a YouTube video. There is pretty good evidence that research that makes it in the news gets more citations, which is something as a scientist you can't ignore. Not to mention the fact that more and more you are evaluated based on what are called alt metrics, which are, you know, how many social media clicks of various kinds you get, and how far you make it basically in terms of newsworthiness. And so I think there's a double irony here in that it's not just the PR agenda that gets hijacked by just, you know, the self-referential process of getting more and more impact no matter what the science is. The science itself might probably follow up in having more and more people studying football kicks rather than important matters. I suspect.
I think, yeah.
I'm Stuart Parkinson from Scientists for Global Responsibility, and we are a group of scientists who do campaigning, and we are open about it. Part of the reason why we are a group of scientists doing campaigning is because of the influence of powerful interests around science, and one of them is the presence of corporations. And corporations are a major funder of the Science Media Centre, for example. And I wondered if you've done any research on how the sort of funding of this sort of PR exercise and these campaign groups may link towards the sort of promoting these sorts of agendas.
Not personally, but there is some very interesting research being done at the moment. There was a paper at the Public Communication of Science and Technology conference in Salvador in Brazil last week. There was a panel about science media centres. I presented some of the research into the SMC that I told you about today. And Professor David Miller from Bath University presented some preliminary findings which will soon be published in a report which address the funding of the Science Media Centre and whether there is a link between the funders and what they say and how they communicate on certain issues. My recollection of that isn't concrete enough to be confident enough to say in public. I almost included it in the talk. I've got this. Notes that I took when I was listening to Miller's talk and also thinking about doing my own talk soon, okay? So that these are hastily sketched notes. The Science Media Centre, he said, has no specific agenda. He says that he's got evidence that appears to favour particular issues and to have an agenda on some controversial issues. He talked about GM. Funding, he said that corporate and government funding are the largest proportions. Corporate funding would by a long shot, I think, and that he'd found some misstatement of some funding sources. He said that the SMC doesn't favour, the SMC says that it doesn't favour general or sectoral corporate interests. He says that he's got evidence that funders influence SMC activity on some issues, GM being one of them. They say that the experts quoted are all scientists and engineers. He found 20% of the top 100 experts cited weren't scientists. Many of them were lobbyists and campaigners, which seems to kind of back up what you were worried about there. Conflicts of interest. He said that there's significant potential for conflicts of interest among the most quoted voices in the top 100 of the Science Media Centre's outputs in their rapid reaction briefings and in their printed materials, which they scraped from the website. But there will be much more detail coming out on this at an undisclosed point in the future. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be published. It's not my research.
5 to 10 years?
5 to 10 years, maybe.
Oh, sorry. So yes, I think, yes, we have sort of to wrap it up relatively quickly, but yes, you were next.
Hi, yeah, so just quite a quick one. You talked about some of the big stories, and you showed a lot of front pages, mostly from the Daily Express, or where they appeared to have misspelt scientists as fascists. But my thing is, when stories get that big, is it actually still the science journalist writing them at that point? Or is it, presumably, my understanding was normally when it's on the front page, is there not then another link? The science journalist is handing some copy to another journalist who then writes the story. I don't know if you tracked that in your research or whether...
Yeah, I've tracked that.
Because to me, it would seem that then there's another level of misunderstanding that could be abused even further by both sides.
Well, quite possibly. It varies is the answer to that. Those front pages from the Express were kind of window dressing, you know, but they illustrate the far end of the problems that I was talking about in some respects. They would have been done by health scientists, health or science specialists. When stories tend to get taken off science specialists is when they get heavily politicized. So a study saying that if you eat chocolate, you won't get cancer, that's going to be a health specialist who's having to write that story. But if it's GM, if it's climate change during Copenhagen, then there's going to be a power struggle within the newsroom, I guess. For the science specialists will still want in, but they're more likely to be working with or having the story taken off them for a political correspondent or something like that. And then that changes the coverage, changes the tone and the tenor of the coverage quite significantly. So with hybrids, for example, when the science specialists wrote about hybrid embryos, they were far more likely to quote scientists and far less likely to quote other stakeholders in that debate. You're right, they cover it differently. That could be seen as a good thing, or it could be seen as a bad thing in terms of independence.
So I think 2 more very short questions, and then we have to have coffee, I think. Jenny, and then Bruce.
Jenny Metcalf from the University of Queensland. I've been a science communicator for 25 years, and I don't do PR. And when I write, and one of the things I do is write media releases, and we always write about the risk and the uncertainty of the science in those media releases. So I wanted to ask you if you found in your studies whether people distinguish between people who did science communication and people who did PR.
Well, lots of PR people don't like to call them, lots of science communicators who do PR don't like to call themselves PRs, I'm afraid. I mean, if you're writing press releases, that's a public relations job, isn't it? You know, that's the way I see it. You can do it ethically, and you can do it with caveats, or you can do it without. Is that the difference for you? I think the science communicator makes more of an effort to promote transparency and to communicate ethically. Yeah?
I would hate to think that
okay.
that's a hyped or spun anything.
But all PR people, I mean, there are PR people who claim exactly the same. Yeah. I don't understand this difference that you're putting on that. And I don't think it's one that we recognise by most of the people I was talking to either.
Okay, last question.
Thank you, Ruth Dixon from Oxford. It was a really interesting talk, and I wondered, is another pressure on journalists, although you touched on it as part of the whole pack mentality, going against the pack, they can be criticised as being anti-science, even if they're just critical of one particular story or scientist. There's a kind of whole feeling that it's somewhat taboo to criticise any published paper, and I wondered if that's something you've come across.
No. Could you give me an example while you've still got the mic? Sorry.
Well, an example might be if a journalist in your study of the embryo work had decided to actually ignore what the science media centre was saying. And one can think of various examples in the climate change debate where the few voices on the contrarian side are said to be, I mean, they may be wrong, but they're still, they don't think they are, presumably.
Yeah, there are, I guess, professional risks associated with bucking the trend on a big issue like that. And an example in the hybrids campaign involved a senior science journalist. I think I can name him actually, but I'm not certain enough to name him because I can't remember the confidentiality agreement. A senior science journalist running a story involving a very critical senior scientist criticizing a lot of the way that this science was being communicated. And yeah, took a lot of flack for that.
Okay, after this really interesting session, I think we all deserve a little bit of respite before we start here.